Grace Slick never cared about keeping the peace, and now at 86 she cares even less. The truth has a way of aging with a sharp edge, and for Grace, that edge has finally sliced open a vault the rock world never expected her to touch. She spent decades dodging questions about Janis Joplin, dismissing rumors, refusing to add gasoline to the myth. But this time, she didn't dodge. This time, she leaned in, breath deep, and told the story of the woman the world still worships but never really understood. And when she said that Janis carried secrets darker than her voice was loud, the room froze. Because if there was one person alive who saw Janis Joplin without the armor, without the swagger, without the bottle in her hand, it was Grace Slick. Their friendship wasn't pretty, it wasn't poetic. It was a violent chemical reaction between two hurricanes, and now Grace is finally describing the storm from inside the eye rather than the edge. The first truth she revealed wasn't glamorous. It wasn't the kind of thing fans want to put on posters or documentaries. Grace began by saying that Janis's real addiction was never alcohol, never heroin, never fame, it was validation. That single word dropped like a hammer. Validation. She said Janis lived on it the way other people lived on oxygen, and when she didn't get it, she suffocated in front of everyone while pretending to breathe. Grace explained that Janis walked into every room as if she needed to prove she belonged there. She needed the loudest laugh, the wildest night, the most reckless story. But beneath that noise was a woman terrified that if she stopped performing for even 1 second, people would see the shy Texas girl who grew up being mocked, bullied, and dismissed. Grace didn't say it with pity. She said it with the exhaustion of someone who watched that insecurity eat Janis alive from the inside out. Then came the revelation that shifted the entire tone. Grace said the darkest secret Janis carried was not about substances or backstage meltdowns, but about her voice. The iconic, volcanic voice the world worships was something Janis feared more than she celebrated. Grace recalled nights where Janis would whisper that her voice wouldn't last, that it was a ticking clock she could feel in her bones. Grace remembered watching Janis cough blood into a sink after a show, wiping her mouth and running back on stage as if nothing had happened. She said Janis pushed her voice with the desperation of someone who believed every performance could be her last. But no one knew that fear, not the band, not the fans, not even the men she slept with. Only Grace heard it in the quiet moments, the rare moments when Janis wasn't trying to be the force of nature the world demanded. Grace said the world heard Janis roar, but she was one of the few who heard Janis break. Then in 1968, everything changed when they both found themselves on the same bill repeatedly, and the unspoken rivalry grew into something dangerous. Grace described it like two matches trying to prove they could burn brighter without realizing they were both running out of phosphorus. She said Janis would stare at Jefferson Airplane from the wings and mutter under her breath, convinced Grace was judging her. Meanwhile, Grace, who was far more confident and composed on stage, didn't realize her calmness made Janis spiral into a deeper panic. Grace said the jealousy was never about fame or success, it was about stability. Janis envied anyone who could function without falling apart. She envied Grace's ability to drink without blacking out, to party without crying, to perform without losing control. Grace said Janis once told her, half drunk and half honest, "You don't know what it's like to hate yourself so much that you sing to drown out the noise in your own head." By 1969, the tension reached its peak. Grace said the worst night came after a festival performance where Janis felt humiliated, convinced the crowd favored Grace. That night, Janis showed up at Grace's hotel room pounding on the door, screaming that everyone thought she was a joke. Grace opened the door to find Janis shaking, mascara smeared, bottle in one hand and a belt in the other, not because she intended to harm herself but because she had used it to beat the walls of her room in frustration. Grace said that night Janis confessed the secret she had hidden from everyone. She believed she was living on borrowed time, not metaphorically. Literally. Janis said she felt her body failing, her voice thinning, and her heart wearing down from years of emotional combat. Grace said Janis told her that if she ever died, people would call it an accident or tragedy, but the truth would be that she had been crumbling long before the final collapse. Grace described it as the moment she realized Janis wasn't just a wild spirit, she was a wounded one. Then came 1970, the year Grace called the year Janis disappeared before she actually died. She said Janis's final months were a strange contradiction. She was both hopeful and hopeless at the same time. Grace said Janis was proud of Pearl, proud of the band, proud of finally gaining some structure, but underneath that pride was the same familiar dread. She still feared losing her voice. She still feared being abandoned. She still feared waking up and realizing she had no idea who she was without the screaming crowd. Grace said she watched Janis try to rebuild herself while still carrying the same broken pieces. And Grace admitted something brutal: she didn't step in. She didn't force Janis to slow down, to rest, to get help, because in the rock world of the late 60s, destruction wasn't a warning sign, it was a badge of authenticity. Grace said the darkest secret Janis left behind wasn't the overdose, wasn't the loneliness, wasn't the whispered stories of her final days. The darkest secret was how effectively Janis hid her pain behind the persona she created. Grace said Janis was the best liar she ever met, not about facts but about feelings. She lied about being okay, she lied about being confident, she lied about being invincible. And the world believed every lie because they needed Janis to be the embodiment of unfiltered freedom. Grace said the truth was that Janis wanted love more than legacy, peace more than fame, and rest more than admiration. She said Janis didn't die from heroin, she died from exhaustion, isolation, and the weight of her own myth. Grace finished her reflection with a final confession. She has spent 50 years being haunted not by what she saw Janis do, but by what she didn't do. She said Janis's darkest secrets weren't meant to shame her, but to explain her, to humanize a woman the world elevated to legend status without ever understanding the cost. And Grace said that now, at 86, she tells the truth because she doesn't want anyone to remember Janis only as the wild child of rock. She wants people to remember her as the fragile, brilliant, insecure, powerful, terrified woman she truly was. Grace Slick said the part that still haunts her most is how close Janis came to pulling herself out of the spiral in those final months, and how nobody could see the difference between recovery and relapse anymore. She said Janis had a way of faking stability that fooled even the people who knew her best. One moment she was full of plans, recording schedules, excited calls to old friends, and the next she was begging for connection that never lasted long enough to calm the storm inside her. Grace said the final conversations they had were unsettling because Janis spoke like someone who was preparing for a new beginning and an ending at the same time. She talked about wanting to write music that was softer, calmer, music that reflected who she wanted to be rather than who the world demanded she remain. Grace admitted she didn't take that seriously enough, dismissing it as just another restless phase. But now, looking back from the vantage point of 86 years of life, she realizes Janis was trying desperately to rewrite her story before the final chapter closed itself. Then in late 1970, just weeks before Janis's death, everything took a darker turn when Grace saw something she had never seen before. Janis sober for an entire day, but not by choice. Grace said she ran into Janis backstage at a small event, and Janis wasn't buzzing with energy or pacing in her usual pre-show trance. She was quiet, too quiet. Grace described the moment with unsettling detail. Janis's hands were still, her eyes were heavy, her voice was soft, and her entire presence felt deflated. When Grace asked what was wrong, Janis looked at her and whispered that she couldn't feel anything anymore, not happiness, not excitement, not even fear. She said the substances weren't working the same way, the crowds weren't filling the emptiness, and the people around her felt farther away than ever. Grace said that was the moment she realized Janis wasn't just struggling, she was fading. She said the energy that defined Janis, that electricity she carried, had dimmed, and nobody was prepared to see her like that. Grace said she tried to encourage Janis, telling her she just needed rest, but Janis shook her head, saying rest only reminded her of everything she was running from. She confessed that the reason she partied so hard was because silence scared her. Silence meant thinking, thinking meant remembering, and remembering meant facing the cruelty she endured long before fame ever came into the picture. Grace said Janis carried childhood scars that never healed, scars from being mocked for her appearance, her voice, her wild spirit, scars from being called ugly, weird, and too much by the people who were supposed to shape her self-worth. Grace said Janis chased applause not because she loved fame, but because applause drowned out the ghosts of every insult she heard growing up. Grace claimed that Janis believed she owed the world a performance every second of her life, because if she ever stopped performing, the girl who was bullied in Texas would resurface, and she couldn't bear the thought of that. Then, in one of the most chilling revelations, Grace said Janis predicted her own death without actually saying the words. She recalled a conversation just days before the overdose where Janis joked, half-heartedly, about people dying young in rock. But underneath the sarcasm, Grace heard resignation. Janis said she didn't expect to become old, didn't expect to one day sit in a rocking chair telling stories, didn't expect to be remembered for anything other than the intensity she burned with. Grace said the most haunting line Janis ever spoke was when she said, "I don't think I was built to last. Some people are matches, some are candles, I burn fast." Grace said she laughed at the time, thinking it was just Janis being dramatic, but now she realizes Janis wasn't being poetic, she was being honest. Grace said what the world never knew is that Janis battled a loneliness so deep it swallowed her even in the middle of applause. She said Janis couldn't keep stable relationships not because she didn't want love, but because she didn't know how to believe she deserved it. Whenever someone got close, Janis pushed them away before they could abandon her. Grace said Janis once told her that leaving people first felt safer than being left behind. It was a mindset built from years of rejection, years of feeling unlovable, and years of believing that anyone who cared about her must eventually see the flaws she spent her life trying to hide. Grace said that fear drove Janis into the arms of alcohol and heroin, substances that didn't judge her, didn't leave her, didn't ask anything from her except her body and her time. Grace said the most misunderstood part of Janis's story is how hard she actually tried to get clean. She didn't want her life to end the way it did. She wasn't chasing a dramatic exit. She wasn't trying to become a myth. She wanted to be normal, whatever that meant to a woman who had never been allowed to feel normal. Grace said Janis attempted sobriety several times, but every time she tried, the crushing emotional weight that substances masked returned even heavier. Grace said Janis wasn't addicted to the high, she was addicted to the escape. She wasn't addicted to heroin, she was addicted to not feeling broken. Grace explained that Janis's darkest secret wasn't the drugs themselves, but the reasons behind them, the silent battles she never allowed anyone to witness. And then Grace revealed the part that stunned the rock community when she first said it. Janis wasn't as reckless as people believe. She wasn't constantly out of control. She wasn't stumbling through every moment. In fact, Grace insisted Janis had long stretches of clarity, planning, discipline, and ambition. She said Janis was far smarter, far more aware, and far more introspective than history gives her credit for. The problem was that the world didn't want Janis Joplin to be thoughtful. They wanted her to be wild. Grace said the industry capitalized on that image because it sold records, sold newspapers, sold tickets, and sold the illusion that Janis was the embodiment of the counterculture's chaotic freedom. Grace said the truth is Janis was trapped inside the character people expected her to be. And the more she tried to break free from that character, the more the world forced her back into it. Grace admitted she saw all of this happening but didn't know how to stop it. She said the 60s rock scene was built on the idea that suffering made music better, that chaos made artists authentic, and that self-destruction was part of the job description. She said the culture celebrated brokenness as if it were a badge of honor. Janis didn't just fall into that mindset, she was pushed into it, encouraged to stay in it, and rewarded for drowning in it. Grace said the darkest part of the truth is that Janis didn't die alone by accident. She died alone because the world loved her pain more than they loved her peace. Grace then told a story she said she has avoided sharing for decades. A few days before Janis died, Janis called her late at night. Grace didn't answer. She said she was exhausted, half asleep, and assumed Janis just wanted to rant about something trivial. But the voicemail Janis left was short, soft, and unlike anything Grace had ever heard from her. Janis said she felt strange and off, that she didn't want to spend the night alone, and that she just wanted someone to talk to. Grace said she erased the message years ago because she couldn't stand to listen to the sound of Janis's voice in that moment. The voice of someone reaching out one last time. Grace said she still regrets not answering that call, not understanding the weight it carried, not realizing it was the final plea from a woman who spent her whole life pretending she didn't need anyone. Grace said that after Janis died, the world mourned the legend, but she mourned the person. She said the hardest part was watching documentaries, interviews, and tributes paint Janis as some unstoppable force of nature, while ignoring the vulnerability that defined her just as much. Grace said Janis would have hated the way her story was told, because it glorified her pain instead of revealing her humanity. She said Janis wanted to be remembered for her strength, not her struggles, for her soul, not her suffering. Grace ended her reflection by saying the world has spent 50 years trying to understand Janis Joplin, but they've been looking in the wrong places. They study the concerts, the recordings, the rebellion, the drugs, but the answer isn't in any of that. The answer lives in the quiet moments she tried to hide, the secrets she whispered only when she trusted someone enough to tell the truth. Grace said Janis's darkest secrets weren't about scandal, they were about fragility. They were the secrets of a woman who felt everything too deeply, who loved too intensely, who feared too fiercely, and who never knew how to silence the inner voice that told her she wasn't enough.